Drivers in gas-burning cars have been paying sky-high prices at the pump. Gasoline was responsible for about half of the higher-than-expected rise in consumer prices in March of 2022. But another fuel most Americans will never use is pushing up the prices of goods and sending shockwaves through the freight industry.
The price of diesel is probably the bigger headline here. Prices absolutely soaring.
Diesel hit its highest recorded price ever on March 12, 2022, shortly after Russia invaded Ukraine. Economists say the rise in diesel prices is driving up inflation everywhere.
Everything that we buy in the grocery store, things we get delivered to our home, are powered by diesel. Diesel is key to businesses trying to get things from here to there. Businesses are paying more. It's going to cost us more as consumers.
The spike is also hurting large numbers of the country's roughly 2 million trucking companies. The vast majority of those are small businesses.
I got lower profit margins because I've been spending a whole lot more money as far as on diesel. Roundabout, let's just say for argument's sake, let's just say if I spent $10,000 1 week, now at these rates I'm spending about $17,000 to $18,000 per week.
The freight industry is vulnerable to frequent booms and busts, and industry insiders see another bloodbath on the horizon.
We see when fuel surges as much as it has over the past couple of months, that's usually when we see a lot of trucking bankruptcies follow, because these small operators that live essentially on the cash flow of their trucking operations are not prepared and don't have the balance sheets or the cash position to absorb these instantaneous shocks to their cash flow.
Diesel makes up more than a quarter of the total energy used by the transportation sector. The fuel is named for Rudolf Diesel, the inventor of the diesel engine, a type of engine that uses extreme compression to ignite fuel. Diesel engines run on something called distillate fuel. Like gasoline, it comes from crude oil, but diesel is heavier than gasoline. There are several types of distillate fuel. The one used in diesel engines is usually just called diesel. Diesel engines produce more low-end torque than gasoline engines, which basically means the engine doesn't have to work as hard to deliver power. It makes diesel engines great for heavy-duty vehicles that have to tow or climb. Diesel engines also tend to get far better fuel economy per mile than gasoline. For that reason, just about every vehicle that moves goods, ships, barges, trains, and trucks, all run on diesel fuel. It is also used in construction equipment and farm equipment.
Anytime you see surges in diesel prices, then the trucking companies that are responsible for moving those goods end up having much higher costs to move product from point A to point B.
It's the fuel of the economy. Everything. Groceries, hardware store, clothes, everything is shipped via truck and train. You're talking about a profound impact on the transportation networks, the logistics, and it's going to keep going up.
Russia is one of the world's largest oil producers. In 2021, Russia exported an estimated 4.7 million barrels of crude oil per day. About 2.4 million barrels of that went to markets across Europe. The kinds of crude oil Russia produces, medium to heavier sour crudes, tend to be well suited to producing heavier refined products, such as diesel. European demand for diesel has been a prominent factor in the rising cost of the fuel. More than 40% of the cars in Europe run on diesel. In addition to its crude oil exports, in 2021, Russia exported 750,000 barrels per day of diesel to Europe. That amounts to about 10% of the region's demand. New shipping fuel regulations put in place in 2020 by the International Maritime Organization require that ships use a form of fuel much closer to the diesel fuel used by truckers. In April 2022, distillate fuel inventories, which include diesel, were 23.6% below where they were at the same time the previous year, and 20% below the 5-year average. A lot of that is due to the global energy crunch in the fall of 2021, when Russia curtailed shipments of natural gas to Europe. Also, countries such as China, low on coal inventories, began burning more diesel for power generation. Refinery capacity has also been down.
Got a number of refineries across the country in Canada that are switching over to biofuels, and so they're kind of offline And, on top of that, coming into this period, the inventories of diesel were thin. There wasn't a lot in storage.
The United States is actually a net exporter of diesel fuel. For example, in mid-April of 2022, the U.S. exported 1.74 million barrels of distillate fuel and imported just 154,000 barrels. Meanwhile, prices for all kinds of goods and services have been rising for a variety of reasons and for quite some time.
What's happened in the current period is two things. The pandemic. So the pandemic has scrambled global supply chains, created shortages for everything from vehicles to consumer electronics, and that causes prices to jump. And then more recently, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has caused disruptions to oil, commodity markets, agricultural markets, and that's caused prices to jump, particularly for gasoline and, of course, for diesel.
The spread in price between diesel and gasoline was about $1 in March and April of 2022. That is a record high and far greater than the 30 to 40 cents that has been the average over the last few decades. Zandy calculates that about 1/10 of the acceleration in consumer prices over the past year is due to diesel costs. So is about 17% of the acceleration in the cost of goods.
Typically, inflation is about 2% per annum. So you take all the things you buy, all the goods and services you buy, and you look at the price today compared to a year ago. In a typical time, that would be up about 2%. So you don't even really notice it. But now inflation is 8%. That's a big difference between 2 and 8, and you feel 8. You can feel it in, when you shop in the grocery store, you can feel it when you fill your gasoline tank.
Zandy expects this to moderate as the Federal Reserve raises interest rates.
The Fed's goal here now is to kind of slow down the economy's growth rate, slow demand, and they do that by raising interest rates. That makes it more costly to purchase a home, makes it more costly to buy a car, makes it more expensive for businesses to invest and to hire, and that slows the growth in the economy down, and that takes some of the steam out of inflationary pressures.
But there is only so much the Fed can do.
Most of the problem with regard to inflation is supply. It's the pandemic, supply chains, labor markets, it's the Russian invasion. Fed really doesn't have any control of any of that. So they've got a tough job trying to get inflation down when they're working on a problem whose causes are independent of things that they have control over.
Even if consumers see better prices at the gas pump and the grocery store, the trucking industry will suffer. As of February 2021, there were about 2 million trucking companies in the United States. The vast majority of them are small. More than 90% of them have just 6 trucks or less. 97% have 20 or less. There are a small handful of large trucking companies that can afford to partly offset their diesel costs by buying wholesale. But most companies have to buy fuel at the pump, just like any other driver.
When these prices shoot up, the truck stops immediately adjust the prices at the pump to reflect that. And then if prices go down, those large trucking companies or the wholesale prices will move down. But the retail prices that are paid at the pump don't tend to move really quickly. The truck stops keep them higher for longer. So those small trucking companies that are buying fuel at retail end up paying much higher retail prices than what your larger trucking companies do.
Companies are supposed to be able to offset the cost of diesel fuel increases with diesel surcharges.
Fuel surcharges are basically agreements paid by companies that are using trucking companies, the shippers that are paying trucking companies to move their goods. And the idea is that as diesel prices move up and down, trucking companies can offset that increase through these fuel surcharge relationships.
This, again, favors bigger companies.
Usually the larger trucking companies are the ones that have these fuel surcharge relationships built into their contracts. The small trucking companies don't. Small trucking companies operate predominantly in the spot market. And so they basically are responsible for paying for their fuel out of whatever they charge the customer and have to eat any increases. Whereas the larger trucking companies are largely able to pass those increases off in fuel surcharges, which offset their increases and their exposure to fuel prices.
Lyle Hankins runs Dow Trucking with his wife LaToya. Based in South Carolina, he has about 16 trucks. The company has good relationships with companies that have operations in South Carolina, such as BMW and Dollar General. But when truckers are returning from trips out of state, they have to get their loads on the spot market through brokers.
You have to deal with spot freight coming back from the brokers. You don't receive a fuel surcharge in most cases.
Hankins doesn't buy wholesale diesel. The fuel pump pricing has been brutal.
One day I was actually at the pump with one of my drivers, and the guy was changing the sign, and the guy across the street was changing his sign. So he went up 2 cents, the guy across the street went up 3 cents. This guy changed his sign up and went up 4 cents. They both looked at each other, gave each other thumbs up, and went up 5 cents. And I'm like, for real? What about me?
The fuel spikes have been just another one of the challenges the business has faced over the last few years.
Nothing is stable. Everything is always up in the air. Some loads get canceled. Some loads never make it. Some loads are a month and a half out. And I might have had to push it out another 2 weeks just because of logistical reasons behind it. I mean, there's just no rhyme or reason to it.
Hankins has tried to expand into new businesses to stay afloat and grow. He has taken on more intermodal trucking jobs. That is where shipping containers are placed directly on trucks. He has bought more equipment. He has begun offering classes for people trying to get into the trucking industry. Dow also has a roadside service business. He has even tried his hand at some Web3 business ideas.
I know that sounds like weird when you talk about trucking industry and Web3. Well, it's a whole nother market that we hadn't really tapped into. So now that we've tapped into it, it's like a revitalization of the trucking industry. We actually have NFTs. I mean, it's just different ways of working it so that you can actually still sustain. And now we're actually moving things using cryptocurrency versus actually using the dollar.
Hankins said he is luckier than some, including friends of his who are trying to get out of the business.
I can afford to take some losses here and there, and I can float my fuel prices by actually with the losses that I'm taking, and I can still sustain. But other people that I know cannot, because some of them are newer and they just don't have the capital to do so.
It is unclear when prices will fall. One petroleum analyst said in April of 2022 that prices could remain high for another 6 to 12 months. That is especially given the likelihood of sanctions on Russian oil. It depends on how quickly U.S. producers can ramp up production. They are dealing with the same supply chain shortages so many other companies are facing. While surges in gasoline prices have sparked interest in electric and hybrid cars and SUVs, trucking industry insiders say don't expect to see large electric semi-trucks taking over the highway anytime soon.
The reality is it doesn't make a lot of sense for trucking companies to go and invest in electric vehicles because the infrastructure isn't there and the equipment, the trucks themselves have not been proven out to be able to haul freight around the country and match the performance or the unit economics of a diesel truck. And we don't think it's going to happen. We think it's still a few years out.
Countless supply shortages have starved the global economy since early 2020. As with many other goods and materials in short supply, there are no feasible alternatives to diesel fuel in the short term. For now, diesel engines will continue to move just about everything, whatever the cost of doing so.